So tonight, again, last time we did the sacred in terms of space, time, and ecstasy. We'll do the sacred again when it comes to Judaism, and we'll talk about anthropomorphism and tradition. Tonight is myth as noun and verb, and then when myth comes around again with Christianity, we'll talk about its shape and relations. So we're breaking up the lectures on the lenses into twos. And then this, of course, is the story and stories of Hinduism. So I hope you can read that okay, but I'll go with it. And I'll explain it. I like to think of myth. A lot of these religious studies terms have divergent and even opposite meanings from popular culture, right? So sacred, I don't know if that's even used in popular culture anymore, but myth, ritual, and some others have the exact opposite meanings in popular culture. And in fact, I like to think of myth as having three meanings, and that's a kind of derivative of the definitions and uses of myth in various levels of culture. So that's why I call it the archaeology of myth. So I like to see myth, lowercase, as a false story. We probably use that a lot. The myth of the Cubs winning a World Series. Whoops. Oh, busted. Myth, capital M, as a particular set of stories, right? So Greek myth, Roman myth, Mesopotamian myth. But myth, all caps, is what we don't talk about, we maybe even can't talk about, because it's a story that culture tells itself and that we tell ourselves that's so true, and I'm going to define what I mean by true, that we can't even hear it. Jackson Browne has this great line in one of his songs. He says, "It's like a song I can hear playing right in my ear, but I can't sing and I can't help listening." That's myth, right? And I'll explain why that is. So let me go through this here. So I've got, if you know archaeology, they're like tells, so that you like drill straight down a small area at first, so you can kind of get the layers. So there are two tells here. There are individuals and cultures, and we're cutting through these layers, if you'll bear with my extended metaphor here. So myth as a false story, we know it's the superficial layer of myth. And for the individual, that's just the everyday, uncritical thinking. I think a lot of our work has to do with myth, like in a mission statement for your company, maybe, is a myth. It's like, yeah, whatever, on the cultural level, this is mass media. I'm dating myself a little bit. I don't think we even use that phrase anymore. Social media. There you go. So stories, right, that are going around about, what color is the dress? Do you know that one? Oh, okay. I know more about social media than you do. Okay. Yeah, I think it was last year. I'm not actually on Facebook. I got off, but I heard about it anyway, because there was this dress, and everybody said it was, well, not everybody. Half the people said it was white. Other people said it was blue. It totally blew up the internet, because we couldn't decide on what color this dress was. We called in opticians and optics scientists, and people got mad, of course, because it was obviously white. So I don't know what's going on there. So popular culture, we like stories. In fact, we more than like stories. We can't live without a story. So just think about it. everything's a story, like on the front page of the New York Times tonight. It may not be in story form. In fact, it's rarely in story form these days. It can be 144 characters in a tweet, but there's a story behind it. So, for example, when you fall in love, you're telling two stories. You're telling your story to the other, and you're trying to, or you hope, or maybe it merges into one story, but not quite. I've been watching some sports lately, and I'm fascinated because most of the sports talk is utterly worthless. I mean, you play the game and you see the score. What happens in between is, what are you talking about? You're trying to tell a narrative, right? The reason Golden State broke our hearts so much last season was because they didn't fulfill the story, damn it, right? They were supposed to win, right? And they were up 3-1, and damn, why didn't they win? And then, of course, the Cubs have a great story this year. It did seem like destiny, right? That the Cubs would win. And that's the flavor of myth. That's the kind of echo of myth when you feel like something kind of has to happen. So there are named myths that we deal with at the next level. The unusual, critical thinking, our leisure time, like going to plays and the opera, etc., dance. And that's in culture and in the individual. But so we kind of know that. There are stories we know. There are stories we kind of, just bandy about. Stories we know that are as stories, all right? But the deepest level here, or the next deepest level actually, is myth. That level I'm talking about where it's true. And at the individual, in the individual tell, that is the unconscious, that is Freud. And at the cultural level, that's the collective unconscious, or Jung, right? And then beneath that is truth and meaning. So Joseph Campbell was very clear about this, that the stories aren't the end of the story, right? The stories are always pointing to something, and they're always pointing to something that can't be said, but is experienced. So this lowest level is the one right next to truth and meaning. And that's why we can't quite get it. We can kind of faintly hear it, but it's like a fish trying to talk about water in my world where fishes talk. What would a fish say about water? That's us trying to talk about myth. We can talk about tides, currents, depth, but we don't really talk about water because we're always in it. We're always in a myth. So again, etymology, I like etymology. I think it's illuminating. And the Greek word muthos means of the mouth. So William Doty, who has a great book on myth called Mythography, really makes a lot of this, is that it's the ma word that babies say. It's of the mouth, it's muthos. And I've mentioned this a few times. Myth really got what? Misdefined, mischaracterized by our old friend Plato, where he wanted to dispense with myth for the sake of truth. And we've talked a little bit about this in every lecture, and we will talk about it some more. But this difference between the oral culture that produces myth and the literate culture that produces truth cannot be overstated. And it's this that you've heard before if you've been here. It's the Charles Eastman story of the missionary who goes to the Seneca. The missionary gives them the gospel, the story of creation, fall, and salvation. The Seneca respond with a story about the origin of corn. The missionary is angry and says, what I gave you was the truth, and you gave me back fable and falsehood. The Seneca see this as very rude and ask, why we believed your story, why won't you believe ours? Because in an oral culture, that's possible. That's not only possible, it's just what is given. We believed your story, why won't you believe ours? Because the more stories, the better. Because stories are what we live by. They're made of our breath. Why wouldn't we want more stories? Even if it's a story about how we were created and fell, and there's violence in the middle of it, a crucifixion, but if you believe, you are returned, or not returned, but kind of saved. That's a great story. Let me tell you a story about the origin of corn. Let me tell you a story about the woman who fell from the sky. Because the more stories, the better in an oral culture. In a literate culture, there's only one story, because there can be only one truth. Now, this is where Joseph Campbell comes in, as he should, one of the preeminent scholars on myth, and one of the preeminent people of the 20th century, I think. I did not know Manly P. Hall's work before I came here, but I did know Joseph Campbell's work. In fact, my very first publication was on Joseph Campbell. And they're very similar, Manly P. Hall and Joseph Campbell, because they want to see everything. They want more stories, but they also want to see what holds them together. Right? So you'll know Campbell as the hero's journey guy, the one who laid out the anatomy of a hero's path in the world's mythologies. He was a prolific writer and scholar of myths. So he says, and this is myth as a verb. So myth as a noun is those layers, right? Those three kinds of myth. Myth, lowercase, falsehood, superficial, can be busted, myth busted. Myth with a capital letter, particular stories from a particular culture. And then myth, all caps, the deep, true, almost unable to grasp story. That's myth as noun. Myth as verb for Campbell means that myth does these four things. So myth is those three things. Now myth does these four things. So the mystical function, and these are Campbell's words. Traditionally, the first function of a living mythology is to reconcile consciousness to the preconditions of its own existence. That is to say, the nature of life. Indeed. And what does that mean? That is, that's the problem we all have, is we live on this third rock from the sun. It's rotating pretty evenly. It's revolving pretty evenly. What does it mean? We don't know. To know is the mystical function. To know your place in the great mystery, right, is what Campbell's talking about here. It's not to unravel the great mystery. It's to put yourself in relation to it. So it's not a math problem. It's an existential problem. It's a mystical problem. So yeah, really the third planet is really more of the cosmological function. He says the second function of mythology is to present an image of the cosmos, an image of the universe round about. The first one is really about knowing and not knowing. This is more about place. that will maintain and elicit this experience of awe. Oh, we know that language, right? Religion as awe and fear and reconnection. Or to present an image of the cosmos that will maintain your sense of mystical awe. That's referring to the first function again. These are all related. And explain everything that you come into contact in the universe around you. Now, again, you can see this is kind of paralleling our understanding of religion. So there's a deep experience of awe, the mystical function. There's a putting that experience into place, whether it's a locality or the universe. And then there's reconnection in religion. We talked about relegare. And here in myth, there's the sociological function. The third function of a mythological order is to validate and maintain a certain sociological system, a shared set of rights and wrongs, proprieties or improprieties on which your particular social unit depends for its existence. So this is actually myth doing most of its work, is ordering society. So I was just reading today about, did you read this, that there are people lined up in Rochester, New York to put "I voted" stickers on Susan B. Anthony's headstone? That's pretty amazing, right? So for most of the country's existence, our myth, the story we don't quite hear but still affects us, said that women should not vote, said that African Americans should not vote, they were 3/5 of a person. That's changed and may change even more tonight, we'll see. But myth has a sociological function that is functional. And I emphasize that because we don't always like the functions it serves, the way it orders society. And we'll see that tonight in Hinduism especially, right? Ethics, mores, social stratification, those all come from a story. I teach a course called Myth and Meaning in America, and I had a scholar on there who wrote a book called The Myths of America. I can't remember his name now. I talked to him. Anyway, he had these 6 myths, like myth is America as the Christian nation, America as the millennial nation, America as the manifestly destined nation. I think there were 6. And I said, did you miss one? Did you miss any? Anything you would add if you could do it over again? He said, yeah, the myth of white supremacy. And I said, oh. And, I think a few years ago we might have dismissed that, but it's never gone away, if it went away at all, and it's had a chance to emerge in this election in ways that perhaps are shocking, perhaps not. Anyway, sociological, I don't want to get off on that. Not yet, anyway, maybe later. The psychological function. So, of course, the fourth function of myth is psychological. Again, this is Campbell. That myth must carry the individual through the stages of his life, from birth through maturity, through senility to death. The mythology must do so in accord with the social order of his group, right? You can't be a part of a group and have a different mythology. The cosmos as understood by his group, and the monstrous mystery. So you see how he's connecting back to the different functions. You have a myth. Not only do you have a myth, it has you. You're living out a myth by being here, for one thing. What are you doing here? Why are you here on an election night about listening to myth and Hinduism? Well, there's a story there. I don't know it. I might be able to guess it. But you have a story that brought you here, just as I have a story that brought me here. I know parts of it. I don't know all of it. I think one of the nicest things about getting older, for me, is that you begin to see some broader vistas. Like in my 20s, I don't think I had a thought in my head. Didn't seem like I had a thought in my head. My 30s, I was still a dumbass, kind of. I feel like, I had a PhD, but I was still a dumbass. Feels like now. But see, that's because I'm looking back, right? And I can see things I couldn't see before. Yeah, thank you. So, we have our own myths. And as I said, your myth is being enacted right now that brought you here, that made you vote for whomever you voted today, or made you not vote. Myth is the water. We are the fish. We are swimming in it always. And we might detect various variations in it, but we are always in it. And so I always tell students it's like Archimedes. They're like, who the hell is Archimedes? And I'm like, Archimedes, the great Greek engineer who said, and scientist who said he would move the world if he could only find a place to stand, right? That's the study of myth. Where are you going to stand to study myth? Scientifically, objectively, you can't stand outside of it, because even science is a myth in this sense of a story that defines you. Even the Big Bang is a story. As I tell my physicist friends who want to talk about reality, I say, tell me about reality without using symbols. And they say, well, it's like this. I said, well, those are symbols. Those are linguistic signs. And so they'll draw out a formula. I'm like, those are definitely symbols, dude. So, that's what I'm talking about. You can't get out of language. You can't get out of what language makes, which is a story. So now let's shift to Hinduism. In rereading about Hinduism over the past week, I was struck again by two things that are unique to me about Hinduism, and that are two words really, and that is multiplicity. So you may have heard that Hinduism is the religion of 33 million gods, or 330 million gods. And I think the Vedas say it's actually only 33 gods. But you get the point, multiplicity. So it's also been said you can believe almost anything and be a Hindu. That's not really an exaggeration, because Hinduism is about multiplicity. Depends on where you live, depends on your family, depends on the deity you worship. Depends on the rituals you heard, the stories you heard, which parts of the Vedas you sing and hear and enact, or if it's the Bhagavad Gita or whatever. And of course, the Indian continent and the places where Hinduism has gone are vast and heavily populated. Add to that Hinduism's multiplicity means that it is incredibly adaptable. You can't, there are Hindu fundamentalists. My former colleague, Paul Courtwright, wrote a book about Shiva and Freud, and he had to get private security because Hindu fundamentalists didn't want him talking about Shiva, and I don't know why, because Shiva is so erotic anyway, but my point is that there are Hindu ascetics, there are Hindu fundamentalists, there are Hindu, you fill in the blank. Hinduism is too vast. It is multiplicity in action. So that's one thing about Hinduism that I want you to think about, multiplicity. The other is convergence and coherence. So you can't live in multiplicity And one of the things that myth does is it reduces the world for you. Right? You cannot live in an infinite amount of stories. You can't even live too many stories at once. You can live a few, but they're going to conflict, and that's going to represent ruptures in your psyche, in your sociology, in your social groups for the social function. You've got to reduce the world. This is basic evolution too, right? I mean, you can't imagine the whole world. You have to survive, you have to go by what you see. You have to reduce the world to what helps you survive and what threatens your survival. Myth does that. Yeah. All right. So, interesting to me that the root word of dharma in Sanskrit, which is the rough equivalent of religion in Hinduism, that's how they use the word dharma, basically means to hold together. So I think it's a lot like the universe, and like there's this massive expansiveness, and yet it all holds together. And what holds it together is dharma, duty. It's more than that, though. It's ethical, and it's more than ethical. It's being, we might call it being centered here in Southern California. The ancient Greeks might have called it eudaimonia, the sense of well-being, not happiness, but well-being. And also devotion to higher calling. It's all that. All right. Now, what's interesting to me, and I hope to you, is the Indus River Valley. It's a fascinating place. And before Hinduism, that is before 2000 BCE, and by the way, that's anthropological terminology, before the Common Era, not error, before the Common Era and the Common Era, to try to make it more historical than theological. You're dating. So before, not before Christ, but before the Common Era of Jews and Christians. There was a civilization in the Indus River Valley that was incredibly advanced and included, we think, a written language. It's somewhat hieroglyphic-like, has not been deciphered. In fact, the latest thing I read on it is that some scholars are now saying it's not a language at all, but it's some sort of symbol system. There are many statues and amulets discovered there. Oh, my goal was achieved. Cool. Awesome. Exercise goal. Right, it was this incredibly advanced civilization. Statues, amulets, religious beliefs, ceremonial centers. They had running water. I mean, not pumped water, but they set it up high and let it run down and run through apartments. They had apartments, drains, wells, trash chutes, granaries. It was an advanced civilization housing about 40,000 people. 40,000 people. This is pre-Hindu, right? So it's the civilization that was in the Indus River Valley. So again, this is so long ago, we're not sure what's happened, because the story of Hinduism at this period is a story told, as it often is in prehistory, by archaeology, which is a great and interesting story, but also widely open to interpretation. So the prevailing view is that nomads came into the Indus River Valley called Aryans and became the progenitors of modern Hinduism, or the Indus River Valley civilization became this Aryan civilization. Now, if you're shirking from the word Aryan, understandable. This is a fascinating little irony of history. Aryan is a version of the word Iran. So when Hitler was talking about, or when anybody, I can't say it's in the past anymore, when anyone's talking about the Aryan race, they're talking about Persians, they're talking about Iranians, because Aryan means noble ones, and these were considered nobles, noble people, because they founded a religion and a civilization. So remember that next time your neo-Nazi friend goes on about Aryans, that he's really talking about Iranians. They were organized into tribes with chiefs called Rajas. And then here we find the earliest caste system for society, 3 classes, and then one that is considered outside of society, the Brahmins, who are the priests, the Kshatriyas, chieftains and their warriors. A man named Siddhartha Gautama is one of these, we'll talk about next week. Vaishyas, commoners and merchants, and then the Shudras, the slaves or servants, who were not full members of society. So once this civilization, this culture developed, it also developed I almost said a scripture. I don't want to say that because I think it evokes the wrong kind of notion. It created books. It created stories, a mythology, if you will, a group of stories that hang together and are related to each other by having similar characters, the same characters, and commenting upon one another. Again, this is the nature of oral culture, is that stories don't get frozen in time. They're always evolving, always fluid. So the Vedic religion was actually marked more by sacrifice. These stories are starting to be developed, not quite yet written down, but starting to be passed around. Sacrifice was actually the common expression of religion, of the Vedic religion, and it could be anything. Like sacrifice is always anything. It's usually just something valuable to you. Sacrifice is an exchange. It's always an exchange. So you have to give something up to get something. It's kind of economic in that sense. But there is one notable sacrifice called the horse sacrifice, or Asvamedha, that was amazing during this time. So a king, so obviously there's a kind of, there's not one king in India, there are provincial kings. And to expand his land, the king would do the horse sacrifice annually, or not annually, but whenever he wanted to expand his land. So the idea was you take one of your prize horses and you send 100 of your warriors with it and you just let it roam. And this is genius in one way and bizarre in another. You just let it roam. So the warriors are like following the horse around. And of course, wherever the horse goes, that's your land. Awesome. Except not everyone's going to agree to that. So another king who's about to lose land to the horse sacrifice king says, hey, I'm not going to stand for this. And so he must fight the warriors. And so he wins or loses, whatever. The borders are redrawn according to where the horse goes. And the warriors win. It's fascinating. When the horse returns after a year, there's an elaborate sacrifice. The horse is dressed up. The queen's court addresses the horse in a way that would embarrass Quentin Tarantino. I mean, the early accounts, the reports of the horse sacrifice are self-censored because the missionaries and travelers who saw it just couldn't bring themselves to repeat the language during the horse sacrifice that's addressed to the horse. And in fact, the horse is sacrificed and the queen literally copulates with the severed horse penis. So, Vedic religion. Now, the Vedas are the oldest now written books, but mythology, if you will, of this new religion. And there's a map of where they're kind of written. But the more important parts are how they're divided up. So there are there are 4 Vedas, and each book in the Veda has hymns or mantras, you probably know that word, ritual materials, the Brahmanas, forest treaties, the Aranyakas, and the philosophical works, the Upanishads. You may have heard of the Upanishads. So these are not, like any sacred text, they're not written all at once. They develop over time, so there's also a kind of developmental sense of these parts. So the philosophical works are usually later, and they are amazing and really rival Socrates and Plato for sophistication, but from a Hindu perspective. So here's one of my favorite creation stories from the Vedas, the Rig Veda, one of the 4 Vedas. And I love this. I love to teach mythology. I love to teach creation stories where you've got the woman who fell from the sky, you've got Genesis, you've got this wonderful African god named Bumba, you've got Egyptian creation, you've got the egg in China, and then you've got the Rig Veda, which says, who really knows? Who can here proclaim it? Whence this creation sprang? Gods came later, after the creation of this universe. Who then knows whence it has arisen? Whether God's will created it, or whether he was mute. Only he who is its overseer in highest heaven knows. He only knows, or perhaps he doesn't know. It's a wonderful skeptical, philosophical questioning in a religious sacred text, right? So again, Hinduism, multiplicity. You can have anything here. We do have creation stories that are a little more specific and involve creatures and creation, the creation. But also concepts of time you may know about in Hinduism, cyclical and eternal, but still they mark ages or yugas. So again, this language may be familiar to you from your other readings in religion, but there are 4 ages, gold, silver, copper, and iron. And remember, we talked about time last time, how time always is a devolution, not an evolution in religion, almost always. And this, as time passes, the Dharma diminishes, right? The religion diminishes. Well, we feel that, right? There's some Sumerian texts from, 18th century BCE, and there's a line in there about how the young people are just so rude and don't understand anything. Right? That's like 4,000 years ago. It's the same story, right? Young people, they drive me crazy. So devolution, right? The loss of Dharma. We're currently in the iron or dark age called the Kali Yuga, that is denoted by cruelty, hypocrisy, materialism, and ignorance. Sounds about right. The interesting part of this in relation to mythology, and this is a fairly common theme in mythology, is that these ages are the creation, actually the destruction of a god named Purusa. So the god had a gold head, silver torso, copper legs, and iron feet. And he was broken up in this eternal time to be put into everyday time. And so we're like moving down his body. That's an image that that we find in the book of Daniel as well. And in Hesiod, I think. Yes, sir. Please. We are. Yes. Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I wanted to tell you that the gold time is actually much longer. These time periods are actually much longer, and they reduce in length too. So yes, we were in the golden age, right? Everything was better. In fact, it was near perfect at the beginning. So yes, we have been through all these times. Great question. And that echoes other world mythologies, like the Hopi believe they are in the fourth world. Some of the pueblos along the Rio Grande believe that it's the fifth world. This is a fairly common notion that there have been other worlds, other eons, other ages that are marked by pretty dramatic shifts in time or events in time. Sometimes people try to connect that to global events. Sometimes it seems to work and sometimes it doesn't. Now, I mentioned the Upanishads. These are just fascinating. And I urge you to read them if you're interested in Hinduism. Excuse me. This is where we get common notions of Hindu, or I don't know how common they are, but if you've heard about Hinduism and karma and samsara and moksha, then these come from the Upanishads. Remember the fourth part of the Vedas, the philosophical parts. And the religion here, as opposed to the Vedic religion of the horse sacrifice, right, which is very different, this is entirely conceptual. It involves meditation, and it's the avoidance of ignorance and the acquisition of knowledge, not through ritual, but through meditation. And so the idea here is that there is one. You probably know this. There is one. We can call that Brahman, but we are part of Brahman, and it seems like we're separate, but it's really the Atman in us that is Brahman. Karma, about karma in Sanskrit, means simply to do or to act. Because we here in Western culture have a different mythology, a mythology of judgment and sin, we tend to attach that to it. It's really much simpler than that. It's more scientific, action and reaction, to do or to act. So simply, if you do something, there will be a reaction. Samsara is the notion that you wander across lifetimes. That's the literal meaning of the Sanskrit, is to wander across. And so that's how karma gets played out, is through samsara until moksha, until you can break free from the attachments you have here. If that sounds familiar, that's because Buddhism's going to borrow most of this Upanishadic religion. All right. Oh, right, that's a great image. The drop of water, a common analogy for Brahman and Atman. There's a story in the Upanishads, the Chandogya Upanishad, I think, where the student comes to the master and says, how do I know Brahman? And the master says, get some salt. And the student does. He says, now put it in the ocean. And the student does. He says, now find it. There is Atman. In other words, it's nowhere, because it's everywhere. Then we get this amazing, the epic, Puranic, and classical age of Hinduism, which is most of the traditional Indian literature that you may know, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. produced between 300 BCE and 300 CE. The Mahabharata is and Ramayana are two epics of Hinduism that, in effect, I think, part of the Mahabharata is something called the Bhagavad Gita. You've probably heard of this, right? The Bhagavad Gita. It means the song of the Lord, and it's only a section of the Mahabharata. So these are long, epic texts that were, of course, epic stories. The Bhagavad Gita is the story of Arjuna, a member of a particular family who's about to go into battle with another part of his family, kind of distant cousins. But these cousins have taken over the royal line, broken the royal line, and inserted themselves into it, and they don't belong on the throne. And so Arjuna has gathered his forces, they have gathered theirs, and they're about to go to war. And Arjuna says, I can't do this. I can't kill my family. I can't kill my brothers. Not surprisingly, the Bhagavad Gita was taken up by American writers like Thoreau and Emerson as a classic because it repeats the similar situation of the Civil War. Interestingly, to people who don't know the Bhagavad Gita and who are looking for a kind of westernized plot, it doesn't end like you think it will. So Arjuna is having second thoughts. He tells his charioteer, I just don't think I can do this. I don't think it's right. I shouldn't kill. His charioteer happens to be an incarnation of the god Vishnu, the sustainer of the world in Hinduism. And the Bhagavad Gita is, in fact, the conversation they have about why he must go to war. He must. Arjuna must go to war. It is his dharma. And when Arjuna says, but the death, the destruction, Vishnu says, these are all illusions. These are all impermanent. You shouldn't be attached to death and destruction. You should be attached to Brahma, to the eternal one. It's a hard lesson, right? The Bhagavad Gita. It's a surprising lesson. Makes you very uncomfortable, but then it's also not uncommon in world religions. We'll talk about this when we talk about community more, but ethics really are a secondary, perhaps even tertiary element in religion. They're a kind of fallback position. They're a kind of settling to have an ethical religious system. And that seems odd because we usually encounter religion now as an ethical system. Oh, you're a Christian, that means X, Y, and Z. Oh, you're a Buddhist, that means A, B, and C in terms of ethics. But that's really not part of the development. That's a later, it is part of the development. It's not part of the initial development. It's part of the later development. And it is a kind of, I'm going to say ethics are a kind of resignation. All right, and you can argue with me on that later. In the Christian tradition, we have Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian, who says the same thing. And he says this in regard to Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac, where, remember, God says, I want you to, what does Dylan say? God said, hey, Abe, kill me a son. God requires Abraham to sacrifice his son. That's ethically inappropriate, one of the most ethically inappropriate things, but it's required for religion. Anyway, I could go on and on, but I won't. Right. So the Bhagavad Gita is actually a rumination on dharma, on duty, on how your duty is so far above I don't want to say it's mundane ethical decisions, but I mean mundane in the sense of the everyday. Your dharma is so far above that that you must go to war with your family if that's what's called for. Regardless of your caste, if you don't, you're going to get caught in samsara. You're going to come back to deal with the karma. Yeah. It's also, I shouldn't diminish, or I should mention that it's beautiful poetry. It's epic poetry. So I would say it's the Indian Odyssey and Iliad, except it's so much longer and so much more powerful for Hindus. Here's a few lines from the Gita. This is Vishnu Krishna speaking to Arjuna. The man who sees me in everything within me, will not be lost to me, nor will I ever be lost to him. He who is rooted in oneness realizes that I am in every being. Wherever he goes, he remains in me. When he sees all being as equal in suffering or in joy, because they are like himself, that man has grown perfect in yoga. And yoga just means yoke. It just means connected to the one. Oh my goodness, I've gone too long again. I'm so sorry. So let me close this up. The Ramayana is again the longest poem in existence, epic poem. Still, I don't know if you've ever been to Iceland, but that's one of my favorite places I've ever visited because the myths there, they're still right there. They're like right there. I don't know if you saw the pirate party almost won the elections in Iceland because they're just wonderfully whimsical. And they came very close to winning. The mythology, like I say, is right there in Iceland. Same is true in India. With the Ramayana, they will serialize this in soap opera-like televisions, and people will come to the station. I mean, they will be rapt watching it. It is the national, or one of the national epics. So it's the story of Prince Rama. There he is in the illustration, who was sent into exile in the forest with his wife Sita and his brother Lakshmana. Sita gets abducted by the evil demon Ravana. Sounds good already, right? Sounds like Games of Thrones or something. But ultimately rescued by Prince Rama with the help of the monkey god, Hanuman. 24,000 couplets. So, yeah, we recognize that story. It's the story of good over evil. It's the story of the helper from Campbell's mythology, mythological journey. Here's a line from the Ramayana. Within infinite myths lies an eternal truth. Who sees it all? Varuna has but 1,000 eyes. Indra 100. You and I, only 2. So you can see there's a line there between that early Rig Veda song about creation song, I don't know who created, I don't know, to this, who can see it all? There's this wonderful sense of openness and uncertainty that becomes a kind of religious virtue. Right, so post-classical Hinduism kind of begins to center on gods and goddesses, and you can worship any god. That's where you get the 330 million gods, and your family might. In fact, a Hindu wedding is where they kind of introduce each spouse's family to the gods and rituals they observe, right? So, okay, you need to know that we're Ganesha family, and we're going to be doing this at this time of the year, right? The gods, of course, have human qualities, but on a grand scale. We'll see that in our next lecture on the sacred and anthropomorphism. And meditative forces began to emerge in Hindu philosophy, the notion of, world denying, this is illusion, trying to connect to the one, etc. Okay, good. Sorry to go a full hour. Tried to stop, but I get going.